And some of you probably have been following some of what's, okay, of course my screen goes black. There we go. Some of you have been likely following what's been going on in education the last few years, especially. You know, there's been a lot of news about free speech zones where you have a room that's this big and that's where you can debate ideas. And elsewhere on the campus, you have to be careful about everything you say because you might trigger somebody, you might make them feel bad. You have, I don't know if you saw last fall, there was a huge deal at, I think it was Yale, where some students were worried about what Halloween costumes to wear because they might trigger people. And so some professor said, well, who was in charge of things said, well, you know, why don't you leave it up to people's individual judgment? And this caused a huge firestorm. There's a video on YouTube where basically a girl is having a tantrum yelling at this professor. I mean, it's literally like watching a 3-year-old yell at the professor. You have what, of course, people who don't want political control, they call it political correctness. On the other side, the left thinks, no, you have to be very careful about what you say, or it's you might be offending other people. That also goes along with the free speech zones. So we have all this stuff going on. How did this happen? How did this happen that we got to this state? And it's quite a long story. The current version of it goes back to about the 70s, but you might be surprised at how far back some of these ideas go. Because I don't know how aware you are of that this stuff is not just going on in higher education, but it's trickled all the way down to first grade. And that's because the people that are teaching the kids have all been taught by collectivists. So, for example, at the Montessori, I don't know how much you know, but I have a Montessori school that goes from 3 years old to 8th grade in Chicago. And some years ago, they were using, some of the teachers were using Weekly Reader, which is this weekly newspaper that's about 4 pages for little children, for first graders that are just beginning. And I started looking at it, and it was filled with climate change propaganda. So I banned that from our school. You know, I said, no, we can't use that. And that's what's going on in private school. But what you may not realize is that the public school model has had a lot to do with this to begin with. To give you a little history, and there's a lot more about this in the chapter that I wrote for this book, Common Ground on Common Core. This book, the editor is a libertarian who got people from across the political spectrum who are against Common Core. Common Core is the latest version of a kind of collectivist control over what the curriculum should be like in public schools. And their aim is to conform everybody to be good employees. We could go into that in a lot more detail, but it's really kind of a crazy curriculum. I don't know if any of you have seen some of the math problems that they have. So she got together this group of people, 17 essays from across the political spectrum, looking at different aspects of Common Core and what the issues are. So there's 17 essays. It's a very good book. I have the last chapter called Liberating Education in here. And some of what I'm going to say today is in that chapter, but there's a lot more detail. If you're interested in buying it, we have this copy, and then we have some special gift certificates that you can use. So the public education model was started in the United States in 1832 by somebody named Horace Mann. His name is kind of on a lot of buildings and things. Before that, children in the United States were educated at home. And at most, they were educated in schools, in small township schools. The legacy of the Pilgrims, I don't know how many people know this, but the Pilgrims were very special people as immigrants. They weren't just the tired, the poor, the wretched, the refuse of the earth. They were middle class, well-to-do people, highly educated, some of the most highly educated group to ever come over as immigrants anywhere, who came over here for an idea. Sorry, I tend to get choked up about this. But they came over for the idea of religious freedom. And they weren't really prepared to be in the wilderness or anything like that, but they really, really valued education. Now, we know that they also have the legacy of a lot of crazy religious control on things, the witch hunts and all that. But they believed that people should be able to read the Bible themselves and make up their own mind. And because of that, education has always been very important here in Massachusetts, and then that spread throughout the whole United States. So you're probably, I don't know how aware you are of that education is a super high value here in the United States. People believe that if you get education, you are going to be able to improve yourself. And it's not true in other countries in the world. You know, some places it is, but in many countries it's not. So this is kind of the legacy from the people that founded the Massachusetts Bay Colony. And if you ever want to read more about it, there's a very interesting chapter in the very beginning of de Tocqueville's Democracy in America, where he talks about the origin of the Anglo-Americans. And he explains how it ended up influencing the whole United States. So but people were privately educated up to 1832, when they thought, okay, we have all these new immigrants coming here. They're not necessarily, they don't necessarily have an educated background, but we have to make sure that if they're going to function well as citizens and participate in the Republic, that they should know things about our history, they should know things how to read and write. We had huge literacy and numeracy even before any kind of public education got started. If I remember right, I have it in my book, the statistics, something like 90% of all white women in the United States at that point were literate by like 1770 or something. And then something like 80% of free blacks were literate by 1810. I don't remember the exact numbers, but it's something like that. So
Okay, 1910?
1810. Free blacks.
Oh, free blacks. Oh, free blacks.
Yeah.
Okay.
I have the exact information in the check. But there was this movement that people were worried that these new immigrants that came from uneducated backgrounds were going to be participating in the democracy without any knowledge. So that's why there was this push for public education. And so Horace Mann founded the first public school on the Prussian system in 1832. Now the Prussian system was something that was encouraged by Martin Luther because he wanted people to be conformed to the state. The state was ruled by the Lutherans at that point. And so you have this legacy of public education and this model that is to conform people to the state, to be good citizens, not to be free individuals. Interestingly, by 1837, self-same Horace Mann complained about the Massachusetts system that he had helped founded. He complained that there is an obvious want of intelligence in the reading classes. The schools have retrograded within the last generation or half generation in regard to orthography. More than 11/12 of all the children in the reading classes in our schools do not understand the meaning of the words they read. I mean, does that sound like something you hear today? 1837, 5 years after they found the public school system. In 1870, William Franklin Phelps, then head of a normal school is a school where teachers get trained to be teachers, then head of a normal school in Winona, Minnesota, and later president of the National Education Association, declared, "Children are fed upon the mere husks of knowledge. They leave school for the broad theater of life without discipline, without mental power or moral stamina. Hundreds of our American schools are little less than undisciplined juvenile mobs." And I just think that's kind of shocking, right? Because we complained here in the 20th century about how bad public education is, but it was going on from the beginning. I know there's a book called Anti-Intellectualism in American Life by Richard Hofstadter. It's from the 60s, and he was a old line Democrat, so it's not, you know, classical liberals or anything writing this. He has a chapter called Teacher in America, and he said that it was very typical that wealthy families in cities and in towns would want to send their children to the public school to support the idea of public schools, And after a few years, they would take them out because they were so badly educated. So this is back in the 1830s too. I mean, when I read those quotes, you almost would think they're talking about what's going on with Common Core. Here's another one. Is this from today or is this not? Our schools are in a sense factories in which the raw products, children, are to be shaped and fashioned into products to meet the various demands of life. The specifications for manufacturing come from the demands of 20th century civilization and is the business of the school to build its pupils according to the specifications laid down. So you can see that, and this is from the beginning of the 20th century. So Common Core, which was developed by the Gates Foundation, and its explicit purpose is to train children in order to be able to be good employees, is just the latest in the whole public education attempt to conform, not to really help people become free individuals with good judgment, making their decisions about their political choices, but people who are going to be conformed to the state. You know, government-run education, its initial goal was its Republican purpose, but its outcomes have been a failure. And there's a very interesting book called Montessori Doing Capitalism by Jerry Kirkpatrick, in which he analyzes the basic problem with public education is that it's a bureaucracy. And in a bureaucracy, the needs of the customers are not what the workers are trying to fulfill, because they don't get their money from the customers. They get their money from the bureaucracy of the administration. And so this is like a fundamental economic problem with this model, and it has a lot to do with why it's failed from the beginning, on top of the philosophical reasons. So, you know, what works well? Well, we know that private education works well, rather than these bureaucracy-mandated programs. And the great thing about private education is that it gives you a wide range of options, right? And its outcomes are notably different. I don't know how many of you are aware that there's this unusual concentration of creative and highly successful people who were Montessori students. This came out recently. A few years ago, the Google founders were interviewed by Barbara Walters maybe 10 years ago, and she asked them, so what do you attribute your immense creative success to? Is it because your parents were professors? And these two didn't know each other before graduate school, and they said, no, we talked about it, and we both decided it's because we both went to Montessori school. And in Montessori school, you're allowed to follow your own interests and get really deeply involved in the things that you think you want to learn, and you're allowed to find creative outlets for what you're doing. But then, a few years ago, there was a study by some business people of top CEOs across the country, thousands of CEOs across the country, and they unexpectedly found that many of these top CEOs at the most creative companies had been Montessori students. They weren't looking for that either. So there's an article was on the Wall Street Journal blog a few years ago called The Montessori Mafia, in which they talk about all the CEOs that were in the Montessori school, including Peter Drucker, by the way. Does everybody know who that is? Okay, Peter Drucker was a famous management expert. Now, a lot of people say, well, you know, if you had, for example, a completely free market in education and you didn't have support from the government for people to go to school, what would happen to poor children? Would they be able to go to school? Would they be able to be educated? The interesting thing is that there's a vast public education system in India, but it has similar kinds of problems that we have here. And there's a huge network of extremely poor people who spend their money sending their children to private schools in order to, so they're able to find schools that they're able to pay for, and the children get a better education in it. Here's another instance that's interesting. In Korea, there's a private tutor named Kim Ki-hoon who earns $4 million a year because of the advantages he gives the children that he teaches. So it seems like even in a controls situation where there is public education and where people's money is already being taken from them in taxes and sent to the government schools, they still find a way to find private education because it's superior. Now, what I imagine is that in a free society, there aren't going to be any serfs to the state, and parents are going to want to make sure that their children learn as well as possible and that they learn to be self-reliant and individualistic. And they learn how to be entrepreneurs, not only in business, but in their own lives, so that they know how to choose what's best for themselves in every realm of their life. And they're able to peacefully collaborate with other people. Those are the kind of characteristics that you need if you're going to exist well and you're going to thrive in a free society. So what would education be like in that kind of society? What would the free market bring to us in terms of education? The funny thing is, I find, is that there's a lot of people in the free market movement, in the classical liberal movement, who are teaching the ideas of freedom, but they don't think about the way they're teaching and whether the method they're using really embodies the very values that they're trying to get across. Because if you think about it, you know, lectures are very popular. Now, what's lecture? There's an authority up there with a room full of people who are supposed to be filled with information, like an empty vesicle, and then give it back to you. Where does that person have an opportunity to really chew over the material, to have their own questions answered, to interact with the other people in the room and hear about, well, what are their ideas about these things? How do they apply it to their life? So I think that it's an issue worth thinking about, especially among people who want to see a free society, that they should think about, well, what kind of methodology actually gives the person learning the habits that they need to make their own judgments about things. And that's one of the reasons why I put together this program for high school and college students, because we use this special we call it shared inquiry methodology that is evidence and reason-based. So it's not just a free-for-all discussion, because that's the first thing people will say, it's just a free-for-all discussion. No. When you're talking about the material, you have to use evidence from the material. You have to reason well about the material. But the advantage is that you're collaborating with the other people in the classroom in order to really grasp what the material is saying, and you're getting a chance to hear the ways that other people reason about the same material. So you get the advantage of learning different perspectives, learning how to use your mind in a different way than you might have thought of yourself. And you're having an opportunity to develop the skills of collaboration. You know, because when you go into the workforce, so much of what you're doing when you're working is you're having to work with other people. And you have to work with other people in a very civil and respectful way. So this gives you an opportunity to practice these skills. So I think that this is something that would be very evident in a free market. But if we just imagine what a free market in a totally government-supported education would be like, I think you would see, think about cell phones, right? And the cell phone market. The cell phone, the electronics market is probably one of the freest in the US. And what do we get out of that? We have this amazing variety of technology, of apps now, you can for doing anything. You have all kinds of different ways of using it. You have Jitterbug, which is the big phone for older people who have trouble, using cell phones. You have the Android, you have the iPhone with like 1 million things, this little computer in your hand that you can use it for. Imagine what that would be like in education, where you'd have one school that's an urban school, and maybe the parents want their children to get a classic, an education in the classics. You have another one where the parents believe in having the students do a lot of outside work, maybe working on a farm, learning their subjects in relationship to a farm. You'd have another school. You'd have schools for children who were, high IQ, really academically oriented. You'd have schools for children that were very good artistically. You'd have schools specialized for children that maybe had trouble learning certain kinds of things. But the whole school would be oriented around their needs. And I just think you just have an amazing, you have schools in an urban environment, you have schools in a suburban environment. We almost can't imagine what kinds of forms we'd see in these schools if we had a free market. But you have to make the parallel to what we have in those other areas that are free markets, right? And all the different things that we get out of them. Now, the other question people say, well, what about children that are too poor? They come from a poor family. Would they get educated in such a situation? Well, I think you'd have the situation like you have in India, where you'd have a lot of poor families that would find the schools. You'd have entrepreneurs giving them an opportunity to go to this school at a rate that they could pay. But I also think when you think about the US especially, we're huge supporters of education, right? We have huge charities with money. And if every single one of you could keep your money instead of having it taken in taxes, I'll bet a lot of you would donate towards helping or give a scholarship to somebody. I think there would be tremendous private charity that would support poor children that wanted to go to school and their parents couldn't afford it. Then there's the question is, well, what about the parents that don't really care? And would those children get educated? And of course, that's a problem today because they're not getting educated, even going to public school. I have a girlfriend who grew up in a welfare family on the west side of Chicago, and she ended up going to Northwestern University, getting a degree in education and teaching in Evanston for 30 years in a very good school up there. And then after she retired, she was going to volunteer in the public schools in Chicago. So she did in one of the poorest areas in Chicago. And it was a nightmare. She said she had third graders. She was just helping this new teacher. They were swearing like sailors. They didn't know their letters. They were stabbing each other with pencils. And anybody that wanted to learn, she had to take out into the hallway to learn because they were harassed so much by the other students. So this was just typical in this public education system. Now it's not true everywhere. I mean, Chicago's really bad in that respect, but there's a lot of places like that. So what would happen to those children whose parents don't really care, right? Well, I think people who were concerned about the problem would come up with incentives for those parents to put their children in school, and they would create schools where they could put them. So these are just some of the ideas I have about what education could be like in a free society. And I think the market would bring us untold riches. We can't imagine how fantastic it would be. And so at this point, I thought I'd open it up for questions in case anybody has any questions they have about. Oh, I know one thing. Wait, back up. There was an important point that I forgot about that I wanted to bring. And that's bringing in, how do we get to the point today where we have trigger warnings and political correctness and all this? Well, in the 60s, you probably are aware that there was this, cultural revolution where the students of the New Left philosophers, the New Left was a movement that realized they couldn't get straight communism going over here. So they had to finagle with the ideas and come up with things like egalitarianism in order to, and think about it, egalitarianism plays on a value that we have in the United States, which is that people should be treated equally. But what we mean is they should be treated equally before the law. That's the classical liberal idea, that the government should not treat people differently. But there's no recognition necessarily that people aren't going to be different, because we all come with different characteristics and abilities, right? Well, the New Left takes that desire that we have and then twists it around so that it makes everybody feel guilty that everybody is not actually equal, right? Is not actually materially equal. And so this is just one example of what the New Left philosophers were doing. In the 60s, a famous one is named Herbert Marcuse. And they taught all these kids in the top schools like Berkeley, Columbia, Northwestern, all these places. And then they went out and started protesting. But they made a lot of trouble, but what they found out was that they couldn't change the culture directly. So they retreated, and I even have a quote, I don't have it right here, but I have a quote from one of them. It was in the Chronicle of Higher Education, who said, "A lot of people thought that we disappeared, but we didn't. We just took a new tack, and we went into education." And so they purposely became professors with their leftist ideas, and they spread them all over the universities. You know, there's an odd characteristic about university professors, which is that 94% of them are Democrats. Now, well, that's not a normal distribution, so there's something wrong with that. So they went into education, and people, for example, like, how many here who knew who the Weathermen were? Did anybody want to explain who they were?
Well, what I knew about them anyway was that back in the protest period in the late 60s, that they grew up and they were sort of grew out of the SDS, the Students for Democratic Society, and they were quite a radical group, quite a number of whom actually turned to bombings and things of that nature, and there were a number of them, what was it? Dorn, the woman.
Bernadine Dorn.
Bernadine Dorn, right? And then there was
Bill Ayers.
Bill Ayers is well known, and of course he's become a professor of education at the University of Chicago in Illinois, right?
Right.
Yeah, so they produced quite a few other people, some of whom spent decades in jail, and many of whom never spent any time, like Bill Ayers.
Ayers was the son of the head of Con Edison in Chicago, so he had a lot of political pull, and his dad got him out of being in jail for a long time. So he went into education and became, how did they call it, emeritus professor of education at the University of Illinois at Chicago, and he was one of the things he was in charge of was certifying the teachers through the National Education Association. And one of the things they did was they made social justice be something that you had to prove that you agreed with in order to get your certification. So there's many different ways in which they infiltrated higher education, took it over, and it really conformed it to all of these new left ideas. And that's a lot of why we're seeing the long result of it here today on the campuses. It's kind of like the end result of the whole thing. So I meant to put that in the middle of the talk, but sorry. Anyway, so